Good morning. I'm Megan Kluth from the Colorado Respite Coalition in Easterseals, Colorado, and on behalf of the Respite Care Coalition and JFK Partners, I'd like to welcome you to the third of a series of 4 webinars we've been doing this year related to challenging behaviors in respite care. Today's topic is understanding challenging behaviors in adults. We have about 42 people registered, with the majority joining through live webinar, so welcome to all. We're recording today's event and we'll archive it on the JFK Partners website, along with all the other webinars in this series. They can also be accessed on coloradorespitecoalition.org. Following the webinar, you will receive a link requesting an evaluation. You may also request a contact hour in the evaluation and it will be emailed to you within about a week. Web participants can ask questions via the chat box throughout the webinar. Please do make sure to go ahead and mute your video and microphone before we get started. And for anyone here in the room, we'll also be able to do questions and just we'll walk around with the microphone for you. For those in the room, we've handed out a flyer about a survey that JFK Partners will be administering. We'll also be sending this by email along with the evaluation for those joining by webinar. So please check that out and complete the survey if you're able to. We also have a training and discussion guide available following this so that if people in your agency or other people in your community might be interested, it can have kind of a more robust discussion following the training. So thank you all for joining us. We are very blessed to have 2 great speakers today talking about challenging behaviors in adults. We're going to be starting this morning with Judy Detmer. Judy has been working in the field of brain injury for over 25 years. She's currently the director for MINDSOURCE, the Brain Injury Network at the Colorado Department of Human Services. In this position, she oversees all activities related to both the Colorado TBI Trust Fund program, as well as a federal grant funded through Health and Human Services through the Administration for Community Living. Ms. Detmer has worked extensively with adults, children, and family members of individuals with brain injury. Judy has also assisted with research efforts related to brain injury and has conducted countless presentations, classes, and seminars on brain injury, both in the state of Colorado and nationally. So we'll be getting started with Judy here shortly, and then following her presentation, we have a presentation from Alexa Cataldo. Alexa is the Regional Director of Boulder County with Sample Supports, a provider agency for youth and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Sample Support specializes in supporting individuals with intensive behavioral needs in community-based settings through their comprehensive programming and residential, behavior, and community-based day and employment settings. Recently graduating with her master's in license in social work from the University of Denver, Alexa's experience focuses on reintegrating high-needs individuals transitioning from institutionalized settings into the community to create lasting and meaningful placements in the least restrictive environment. So we are very grateful to both of our speakers today, and let's go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Glad that you're all here, and I'm excited to be a part of this series around behavior and working with individuals. And specifically today, I'll be talking about brain injury. We would like you to hold your questions until I'm done because we've got about 30 minutes and I have a lot of information, so that way I won't get too off track with the great questions that I'm sure you'll have. So today what I want to cover are do an overview of what brain injury is. Some of you may be aware, but others may not have as much background in brain injury. But then we'll dive into a little bit about behavior and brain injury and strategies related to supporting individuals with brain injury. And then lastly, we'll talk about resources. Just a quick word on who I am and what our program is. So we are MINDSOURCE Brain Injury Network. As was said earlier, I'm within the Colorado Department of Human Services. And so we have a traumatic brain injury trust fund in Colorado where we collect surcharges on DUI, DWAI, and speeding convictions. Those funds come through my program. And what we do is provide services for individuals with brain injury. And by services, it's specific case management services. We conduct research related to brain injury. We do competitive grants around that. And we also award community projects to educate communities about brain injury. The other things that we can do, though, is provide technical assistance and training. So if you guys ever need any training on brain injury, more than happy to come and do that. I usually partner with my partner at the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado, and Liz Gerdeman is usually the person who does that with me. So we would usually tag team or figure out who's the best person to present. So feel free to contact us if you need that support. And we also have federal grant dollars to support special initiatives around brain injury. Most recently, we did a 4-year grant in the criminal justice setting. So we're starting in a new round now. So I want to start off just to give you a little bit of an overview of what brain injury is, because again, a lot of folks are not as familiar with brain injury. I know you're a little different, but you probably have a lot of co-occurring issues. So let's watch this video.
In Colorado, over 500,000 adults have sustained a brain injury and are living with this disability. Unlike a broken bone, brain injuries are often invisible, so they might be harder to detect. Before you can begin supporting those in your community with brain injuries, you must first be able to identify common experiences and symptoms. How do we define and recognize a brain injury? Let's start with what it's not. A brain injury is not a hereditary condition passed from parent to child. It's not a congenital disease present at birth, and it's not a degenerative state that occurs as a result of growing older. An acquired brain injury, ABI, is any type of damage to the brain acquired after birth. Causes of ABI may include stroke, aneurysm, lack of oxygen to the brain tumor, or external forces applied to the head or neck, otherwise known as a traumatic brain injury. TBI severity is classified as mild, signifying a concussion, moderate, or severe, indicating a loss of consciousness of over 24 hours. The leading cause of traumatic brain injuries is falls, followed by car accidents, assaults, and sporting accidents. Statistically, men are more likely to sustain a TBI than women, and we see peaks at different age groups: children ages 0 to 4, teenagers ages 15 to 19, and adults over 65. TBIs and other acquired brain injuries have common symptoms and outcomes. So what do these brain injuries actually do to someone? Much like a yolk inside of an eggshell, your brain is very gelatinous. When someone sustains a brain injury, brain cells die. And unlike skin or muscle cells, brain cells typically don't grow back. This means that whatever functioning those cells were responsible for is gone. Once this happens, people can experience a variety of symptoms that typically fall into 3 categories. There are physical effects, such as fatigue, headaches, and sensitivity to light or noise. Cognitive effects like confusion, difficulty remembering, concentrating, or making decisions. And emotional effects, such as feeling sad, irritable, angry, or nervous. It's important to remember that the long-term effects vary from person to person and depend on the severity of the injury. However, we do frequently see similar long-term and anxiety. Issues can also arise with the ability to plan, organize, remember everyday tasks, reason, and understand body language, leading to difficulty with school or work. Consequently, it can be challenging to maintain meaningful relationships, and friends and family of those with brain injuries often report that it feels like the person has a different personality. Remember, over 500,000 Coloradans are struggling with lifelong brain injuries that may not heal. But once we can recognize the symptoms, we can start to help those individuals improve their quality of life. For more information, please visit biacolorado.org.
Okay. Okay. So that's just a quick overview of what brain injury is. So just keep in mind that it happens after birth, it's non-degenerative, but I am certain a lot of you folks are working with individuals who have co-occurring brain injury and developmental disability or mental health issues, those kind of things. So we see a lot of overlap in the populations that we work with. So today I'm just going to give you a really quick snapshot in terms of some tools that you can use to think about behavior and brain injury. I can't go into depth because of the length of time. Again, I'm available to do that for you individually if you have these needs, but just a framework to start thinking about brain injuries, to look at what we call the building blocks of brain injury. And this is a format that I've taken from the Colorado Department of Education, but it also applies to adults and youth. So if you think about the hierarchy of neurocognitive development, we all develop in a similar way in terms of we have our fundamental processes, which are all those blocks across the bottom of the building blocks, memory, attention, etc. And then we build on those skills. And then we develop our intermediate processing, higher order, and eventually our goal is to figure out how can we be successful in life, whatever that might mean to the individual. But that's kind of how we build. And so what happens with the brain injury, let's say that you have a deficit in an early age and maybe you have a attention deficit, then what we see is this issue around our building blocks becoming shaky and no longer solid. And so unless we understand kind of where those deficits lie, what areas of the building blocks maybe are missing, and it can be middle, it can be bottom, it could be all over the place, it's really hard to address behavior. So when we look at brain injury and behavior, we look at it from a skill deficit, and I'll get more into that a little later. A way to think about this is, what does this all look like? Because behavior is what you see, it's an observed behavior, right? And so when someone has these various deficits across all these different levels of our building block, you can kind of look at, here's what it looks like to me. They won't come to you and say, oh, guess what, I have impaired attention, I have short-term memory loss. No one's naming that for them. And so what you're going to see with impaired attention is that maybe they interrupt conversation, they get off topic easily, they fidget, they squirm, kind of the typical lack of attention issues. So once you understand that, you can start thinking through, well, how do I accommodate these skill deficits? And the reason this is all important in the context of behavior is because a lot of what we see with brain injury, and it'll be true across disability, but a lot of what we see with behavior is that it's not necessarily a behavior problem. It's usually a reaction to a skill deficit and a frustration around that. And so kind of thinking about this in a simple way and thinking about really tangible strategies is what I'm encouraging you to do. People get intimidated by the diagnosis of brain injury. It's really been stuck kind of in a medical paradigm because it's a medical condition, and when it happens, it's a medical issue. However, for most of the people that we're working with and supporting with brain injury, they move beyond medical needs into kind of that community behavioral health need realm. And so it's not going to be all that unlike what you're dealing with autism, IDD, mental health, any of the other conditions that you might be working with. So again, just thinking very simply, but examples are, if someone has impaired attention, one thing that's really important is to get their attention first and make sure you have their attention before you give them instructions. Keeping instructions brief, to the point, so that they aren't overwhelmed with the information that you're giving them. Maybe giving them cues like look, listen, all of those things. And these feel, again, very fundamental, but that's exactly how you can help prevent behavior problems in the long run. Kind of taking this further, other characteristics of brain injury is a delay in speed of processing. So how we take in information, how quickly we can make sense of the information we're retrieving. People with delayed speed of processing may be slow to respond to questions. I see all my little images are cutting off my words, sorry. Apologize for that. Maybe they appear not to be paying attention. And so another thing that we see a lot is that people with brain injury get kind of mislabeled as having behavior problems because of the way it presents itself. If someone's not appearing to pay attention, maybe they aren't responding to your questions, you could think they got a bad attitude, they're not caring, when in reality it could be a skill deficit that we're not aware of. So again, just thinking simply about accommodations, making sure that you provide additional time for that person to review information, making sure they understand something before you move on to the next instruction or task. Offering assistance. Here's something that we struggle with quite a bit. It sometimes feels like maybe we're supporting people too much. It's a lot of hand-holding. But in reality, if they have the skill deficit, then they need that level of support. So I use the example, if you have an individual who uses a wheelchair, even though developmentally they're at the age where they should be walking, you're not going to have them walk. They can't. Same with brain injury. Developmentally, yes, they should be able to write down the instructions they have. They should be able to do this at work, at school, whatever. But part of their brain has been injured, so they're not able to handle that on their own. Eventually, with enough modeling, enough coaching, enough support, they might be able to do that. But there might be people who lifelong need that level of external support. Another hallmark is memory loss. And when I'm talking about memory, I'm talking short-term memory loss. And so thinking about immediate memory versus that long-term memory. Usually the long-term memory is intact, and that can be a blessing and a curse. So what we know is that youth, when you sustain a brain injury as a kid, physically you recover from that brain injury quicker than an adult or an older adult. But unfortunately, you just don't have as much learning behind you. You don't have that fundamental building blocks behind you to fall back on. And so a lot of times the outcomes are worse because they have to figure out how to shore up their building blocks more than an adult might. But anyway, and they also know who they were. And so just a quick story, I worked with a guy who, we were just talking about this, who was a brewer at New Belgium Brewery. He was a master brewer. And you know, it's easy to drink beer, but it's not easy to make beer. So there's a lot of chemistry involved. There's a lot of timing. It all involves sequencing and things like this. But he, in his mind, thought, I can go back and do this work. And it wasn't until, and they were grateful, I was grateful to them, they were gracious in letting him come back and work through this. But he really needed to go there and in a safe environment, try that skill again to realize he really couldn't do it anymore. And it's because of his short-term memory. He could not remember to go do the different things. It was just complicated. So anyway, that invoked a lot of grieving. And so that's another thing to think about that might be a little different than people who were born with a disability, although they also go through that. But people with brain injuries, if you were on a life course and that was interrupted, say at the age of 21 or 25 or whatever, 40, 50, then there's a lot of grieving that goes along with that because you can no longer be who you were before. So I'm not going to go into each of these again real detail because I'm just trying to give you some idea about how to look at brain injury and not make it overly complicated. So you're really trying to think about what am I seeing? What am I observing in this person? And then what are some simple strategies we can put in place to help support them to be more successful? So you can see, again, with short-term memory, repeating that information, helping them to use a day timer or a planner or a phone, whatever makes sense for them. And that'll be a caveat throughout this whole thing is don't assume that they know how to do this in the first place. We work in the criminal justice setting, as I mentioned earlier, and a lot of times, you know, we've really got judges to become pretty supportive in terms of understanding they have a brain injury. And so they'll say to the individual, well, you have an appointment at X time, put that in your planner. Well, if the person has been taught how to use the planner, they can't put it in their planner. So you need to just kind of step back and think, where are they at in terms of their skill set and being able to implement these strategies? Motor skills, and so this one, and this is really a very closely tied issue with behavior. And what happens when we talk about sensory motor, it's all your senses. It's your sight, your sound, taste, you know, vision, all of that. And what happens with people with brain injuries is that they can become quickly sensorily overloaded, not unlike autism again. And so, you know, if there's bright lights, if there's a lot of people, a lot of noise in a room, it's going to be harder for them to filter out all those distractions to focus in on what it is you're trying to teach them or work with them on. And so if you see someone getting agitated, maybe they're looking like they're overwhelmed or they melt down or something related to that, then we need to be the external cue for them to say, it's time to just take a quick break. Let's take a 5-minute break, go, you know, do what you need to do, and we'll come back. Because what I find that people try to do is really push through that time. You know, we all have our scheduled lives, which is the reality of our worlds now. And so it's hard to be able to just kind of interrupt your process with somebody to take that break. But if you don't, you're getting nowhere except for having someone who probably is going to have a meltdown on your hands and an anger outburst, or just shut down altogether. And you get frustrated as the person trying to help the individual. So it's just important to say, okay, we're going to just take a break. And what is really helpful is if you just set that environment for success in the first place. And that is true with behavior and brain injury across the board, is setting that environment. And I know you're going to talk about that too, Alexa, but setting that environment for success. So thinking about if you're doing job-related work with someone with a brain injury, try not to put them in an overstimulating environment if this is something they struggle with. If you're working in a home where you have someone with a brain injury and you see them getting agitated, think about what's around them, what might be triggering that agitation, and remove the agitation, remove the person from that situation. Keeping things really short and to the point. Also, managing their fatigue. So fatigue and brain injury go hand in hand. I don't, if you have mild, moderate, or severe brain injury, it does not matter. Fatigue tends to be a cornerstone of brain injury. And so you have to be thinking about, are they fatigued? Because if they're fatigued, then they really can't filter the sounds and they can't do all that you need them to do. Other things are related to language, so like social pragmatics, which are really all of those kind of interpersonal communications, the way we talk with each other nonverbally. And this is a particular area that we find folks with brain injury get in trouble in terms of relationships with other people or at work or in their home environment. So they don't do a great job interpreting body cues. We all rely a lot on body cues and nonverbal communication. That's how we as a society communicate in a great deal. Someone with a brain injury is not going to get that. And so what happens is they may get in someone's space, you know, they may not be interpreting that you're in a hurry, you're trying to leave. And so then you get into a behavioral situation. So just understanding that that could be part of the picture. The receptive language is understanding what's coming at you again. And so if someone's saying huh a lot, or they look confused, or if they struggle with abstract language or sarcasm, then that could be a receptive language issue. And then expressive is how we express ourselves as it sounds. And so if you see someone having difficulty staying on topic, maybe navigating those social rules, all of those, that might be an expressive issue. So again, some of the strategies are similar. One that I will talk about real quick is videotaping. It's not something a lot of people have access to, but if you do, what happens with brain injury, and this gets wrapped up in behavior as well, is that a lot of people will say, oh, they're in denial. They don't want to accept where they're at. When in reality, that part of their brain may be damaged, and so they cannot accept where they're at. They can't recognize it. They do not see themselves the way that we see them. And so they, like the brewer that I mentioned, he really thought he had those skills, and he and I went back and forth quite a bit about that in an abstract, sit across the desk discussion. And it wasn't until he went to the brewery and tried it did he understand. And so it's not denial, it's not all those things, it really is that part of his brain was damaged. So if you can videotape somebody, sometimes it helps them see themselves. And seeing themselves helps them learn, kind of, here's what I'm struggling with. And of course, doing this in a really caring, nurturing environment, because it will bring up grieving for the person once they start recognizing their deficits. But until they understand that, then it's hard to move on from there. So receptive language, really avoiding kind of colloquialisms, avoiding sarcasm. You can do humor, it just depends on the person, but a lot of times it will go over their head. Allow them wait time so that they can respond. What I see happening a lot with individuals with brain injury is that we try to just jump in when they're taking a while to formulate their response, and then we throw them off track. It's like, nope, that's not at all what I was going to say, and now I don't really remember what I was going to say. So being careful to allow that time. In expressive language, one thing that I would say is allowing yourself permission. Of course, having a conversation with the individual first to say, you know, I think you struggle a little bit staying on topic. And so when you go off topic, I'm going to bring you back to topic. I'm not trying to be rude. I don't want to not validate what you want to talk about, but you know, we have these things we need to get through. So I'm going to kind of cue you to stay on topic. If you do it in advance and you do it during, then they'll start to recognize that, oh, I'm off topic again, and they won't take offense. If you feel like you can't really say that because it's part of their injury, then they go off topic, everybody's frustrated, and they're not getting their needs met either. So I'm moving now kind of up the pyramid. I don't know if you've caught the color changes, but anyway, so I'm moving up the pyramid. And as we get into the blue area of the pyramid, that's more around executive functioning. And so those are higher processes. And so when we talk about executive function, things like initiation, problem solving, all those things come into play. This is the area that will stump people with brain injury. And if you have poor executive function, then it's really challenging to be able to work. It's challenging to be able to navigate our communities, all of those things. That said, it's also equally important to recognize if those lower functions are not on board, because you can't work on executive function without addressing those other ones first. So you always want to start at the bottom of the pyramid and work your way up, just like a house. And so with initiation, again, it's people can't get started on their own. So these are the things that we see with them. And again, this gets tied into behavior significantly. Okay, so I think instead of nailing on this for much longer, I want to move into kind of the behavior piece, because I don't have that much time left. But I hope that this has helped you kind of have a framework to think about it. You have these handouts for you. If you need more information, again, contact me. But you can see we kind of do this throughout all of the different areas. So I want to get into behavior. So what we look at with brain injury in terms of behavior, well, anybody, my world is brain injury, so I apologize. That is my lens. I've been doing it for a long time. So it's the only thing I relate to as well as I do. So we talk about skill versus will. And so you look at this poor little T-Rex dude, and is this a skill deficit, or is it that he's just not trying hard enough? He can't get the curtain all the way up on the window, right? Skill deficit. He really can't do it. So we need to think about this when we're thinking about people in behavior. Same kind of terminology as can't versus won't. So it's important to really take the time to analyze, is it a skill deficit? Is it a can't? Or is it a behavior in terms of a won't and willful behavior? And the reality is people have everything, right? And so people with brain injury are no different than you or I. Sometimes we too can do something, but we don't do it. And some, like, I could go off a list for you, for me, and sometimes we can't do things. And so that's why we don't do it. And so what you're trying to figure out is this the can't or is this the won't? When do we push them? When do we consequence? All those things. So when we think about behavior management in brain injury, it's no different than other disabilities. The two kind of categories that behavior management fall into is antecedent management and consequence strategies. With brain injury, and probably true with others, but with brain injury, we really focus on those antecedent management strategies, because then we're looking at crisis prevention instead of crisis management. And again, a lot of that will come down to environmental issues and thinking about the environment. So from that moment forward, thinking about how do we look at this individual, the environment they're walking into, and the skill sets that they have and the deficits that they have to help prevent the behavior in the first place. So another way to kind of think about this, if you do functional behavioral analysis, typically when we look at FBAs, we're looking at the top 3 boxes of this little grid here. So you have a problem behavior, you're thinking about the person is motivated to get something or avoid something, right? I mean, that's a lot of behavior management. So maybe they're thinking, how do I get money? How do I get social status? How do I get something? And when we look through that lens, if they don't do something, then we feel a little manipulated. Same on the other side. If they're trying to get away with something that we want them to do, you can feel manipulated. But once you start really drilling down and thinking about what is causing, what is motivating that behavior, what is motivating them to want to get something or avoid something? Is it that they're overstimulated? Is that they don't have social connections, so they're fighting to find social connections, etc.? Then we start to understand it in this paradigm. And so again, going back to our building blocks, if you think about someone having skill deficits, and that is the reason that they're struggling to not have behavioral problems, you are going to think about teaching them the skill. You're going to think less about consequences. Consequences come in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But initially, it's really figuring out, is this a skill deficit? So if someone has poor attention, poor memory, poor learning processing, then they're going to struggle to put into place some of the things that you want them to do. And again, just to reiterate, you have to deal with those lower levels of the building block first before you really get into that executive dysfunction, which is ultimately important to address. But unless they have the ability to attend, you have strategies in place for memory, et cetera, then you can't really address the executive dysfunction, if that makes sense. So skill versus will. If you think they have a skill but choose not to use it, you're likely to think punishment. If you think that they don't have the skill, you're less likely to think punishment, more likely to think about teaching the skill. So it's just kind of changing the paradigm of how we approach this. So kind of putting this into a little bit of into action. You have a behavior at the center of this diagram. You have all these things that now you understand, oh, they have an expressive language issue. They have pragmatic language issues. They have difficulties with attention, with memory, with visual spatial skills, executive functions. All of these things are there. So now you know, it's like, okay, we're dealing with some skill deficits. So then what you want to think about is, how do they function in all their environments? Because they may function well at home, or they may function well at school or work, and not the other environment. So what's going right in those places that help them function in those environments, and try to model that. So if you start thinking strategies, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. The other thing important is to think about what we call setting events, which could be a number of things. So let's say someone got put on a new medication. So therefore they can't, they're dealing with that, and they can't, even the skills that they had now have gone off track. So you have to be mindful of those things as well. So anyway, once you know that, you can start thinking about, here are the things that we can put in place to help address those skill deficits. And then again, you're hopefully preventing those behaviors from happening in the first place. So this is what I talked about earlier. You have to think about how pervasive is your evidence, and where are these things happening. So the performance deficit is the tip of the iceberg. What you really need to do is drill down to these other areas, thinking about the environment, thinking about, do they have the skill? Have they acquired the skill? Have they generalized the skill? And if all that is on place, but then they go off track, you probably need to go back to the skill and reteach the skill. The thing about brain injury that's frustrating for a lot of people is that it's not a learn and done. Oftentimes it's a learn, relearn, try this strategy, do this strategy. And it takes a lot of effort, to be honest. And so just don't keep putting billion time out. That's probably not a strategy that's working really well. So if it's not working well, you got to go back again. What are the skills that are missing? I'm going to leave you, I don't have much time, so I'm going to go a couple minutes over and take less questions, but I want to tell you about a couple resources. And these are all in your handout. And so we have a toolkit about brain injury, have co-kids with brain injury. I know this is an adult talk, but if you look at that website, there's a lot that you can kind of just translate to adult terminology. We have an accommodation symptom booklet. And all of these are referenced in your handout, but I contracted with the VA to put together this toolkit. And it's specific for veterans, but it's applicable to civilians. And it gives you an idea about just what we did. How do you break down what the issue is? How do you teach the skill? How do you do the assessment? How do you support the person? So that's a pretty good website to take a look at. Those of you working with both kids and adults, Co-Kids with Brain Injury is a really excellent website. Same kind of walking you through that problem solving. Because you're just gonna have to know, once you have the person, you're going to start saying, what does this look like? Oh, it looks like this. Oh, that's attention. Oh, here are some strategies to address attention. Here are some assessments we can give, etc. Plus, there's just general information for parents and educators on that website. And then this booklet comes out of Ohio State University in the Valley Center for Brain Injury Recovery. It's a paper version of what I've been talking about. So again, just thinking about what are those things. To end this, though, I want to talk about the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado. As I mentioned earlier, they are a contractor to do services. So we contract with them to provide case management services for all ages. And then for youth, they also do education consultation. And in addition to what we contract with them for, they do a lot of other things that you can see on this list. So if you have individuals with brain injury that you think you're working with and you would like to refer them to the Brain Injury Alliance, they are a huge resource for people in terms of recreation, education. We do classes, workshops, and then case management type support. And so when we do case management, we're looking at resource navigation, quick interventions to help them get the resources they need and meet the needs that they have. And you can access that either online, via email, or via phone call. It's done over the phone or in person if the person needs someone to come out in person. We also have self-management skill building. So if someone is at a place where they want to learn how to do more advocacy for themselves, then they can enter into this program, and it's a 6-month program, an average of 4 hours a month, where we're teaching skills like how do you address your short-term memory loss? How do you address your attentional issues that are getting in the way of you being able to acquire your own resources? And then the last thing is that education consultation that I mentioned. So for those still involved in the school system, we have a school psychologist on staff who will work with the schools, work with the family, work with the youth to help them understand what brain injury is and how to support that kiddo in the school setting. This is kind of how you get there. We do classes and workshops. I say we, it's the royal we, it's really the Brain Injury Alliance. I just pay them to do it, but, but we're pretty involved in framing what the work looks like. Okay, and these are all in your handouts, like I said. There is a conference coming up in November if you want to learn more about brain injury. It's a great, great opportunity. And so if you could get into registration for that, that's great. Now, I think I have about 6 minutes for questions. So any questions at this point that people have? That's usually an hour-and-a-half lecture done in 30 minutes. No? Okay. Yes.
Would you go back to the initiation accommodation slide? I just wanted to see what some of those were.
Okay, don't watch, it's really fast. You bet. I could do this faster, I suppose, but I'm not that smart. Getting there. So these are what you do with initiation. And again, this is the other things that really help with someone in terms of initiation. If you provide a lot of structure in their day and in their job, if you're looking at work support, because the more that becomes rote to them, the easier it is for them to do it. But getting started on a new task is particularly challenging, but really focusing on that one step at a time approach, sitting with them, modeling, getting them started, and then fading back. That's really the key with poor initiation. And these are available, like I said, but I'm always happy to come do a more intensive presentation if you need, or training. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Did I do it right? Yeah. We're just gonna roll. Give me more time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexa. I'm our regional director with Sample Supports. We specialize in working with youth and adults with developmental disabilities. And what our agency is known for is typically we take on the more challenging cases throughout the state of Colorado, where individuals were told perhaps that they would never be able to access the community or hold a job, and we're able to make those things happen for them in a way that's least restrictive and works best. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about positive behavior. And so for our agency, and I think for a lot of individuals in disability services, you're very rarely just looking at the behavior. You're looking at a lifetime of perhaps institutionalized care, traumatic experiences, mental health, socioeconomic impacts. And so for us, what we found to be really successful is looking beyond just the behavior, and as a provider encompassing a positive and motivation-based skill set to encourage the people that you're working with to reach their full potential. And towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about sample supports and what resources we could offer for individuals that you all may be working with as well. So when you're talking about building positive behavior, there are some basic skills and principles of understanding that if you structure your engagement and interaction and support of people with disabilities with, we tend to see higher rates of success. And so I just wanted to break down a couple of the principles here and talk a little bit about how challenging behavior may be impacted by these. So ultimately, we feel that behavior is strengthened or weakened by its consequences. And when you hear the word consequence, you typically think negative punishment. Consequences are simply a response to an action. And so, for example, when Judy was done presenting, we applauded. That was a consequence, right? There was an action that resulted in a response. And so when you're dealing with behaviors, there are of course natural consequences. And so when you're dealing with more challenging behaviors, such as physical aggression, verbal aggression, there may be natural consequences such as being asked to leave a location or, limited engagement in that activity, which we'll talk about more later. But then there are intentional consequences. And so intentional consequences are the reactions that we as providers are creating for individuals to reinforce the behaviors that we're looking to see and to mitigate the behaviors that we're looking to decrease. And so we'll talk more about details and specifically how you create positive consequences, but I don't know if you all feel the same. Typically people respond better to positive reinforcement than negative, just very basic, how we all prefer to exist. So we'll talk about how even though you're dealing with a really difficult behavior, that positive reinforcement serves as a much larger reinforcement than a negative. Oh, I jumped ahead, saving time. Behavior, like I said, ultimately does respond better to these positive consequences, but positive consequences are not always organic. Again, specifically when you're dealing with really difficult behaviors, it's very challenging to find a natural positive consequence to something like physical aggression. And so as providers, and whatever role or program you're working in, you want to increase the opportunity for positive consequence and then build that momentum for the individual that you're working with. So that could be as simple as, just even after an escalation, creating time and space to tell the individual how proud you are of them for turning that moment around. It may seem like a small thing and you may be overwhelmed and frustrated with what that incident looked like, but creating that option for them to hear, even though this was challenging, you were able to make a positive choice today, they're going to remember that part of the day more so than their challenging part of the day. Behavior, like Judy was talking about as well, behavior is largely a product of its immediate environment. I don't know if you all have tried to change a person, but changing people is very difficult. Behaviors take a lifetime to develop, and typically they may take a lifetime to, decrease or to change for a person. So a lot of what we focus on as professionals and as providers is that we want to set up the environment to be successful, and again, focusing on those proactive versus reactive supports. And for those of you who do work with individuals with disabilities, you could set up everything perfectly and you could still struggle with a really challenging behavior. And so we'll get into those reactive and more crisis-based responses as well. But the goal as a professional is to be totally prepared for your day to set that individual's environment up to be successful. It is important to note here that the environment is not perfect. So you don't want to over mitigate the environment and eliminate all sorts of, random pieces that could jump into a day, because that doesn't support generalizing the behavior as well. The proactive piece is really for you as a professional to feel trained, prepared, and to have the tools you need to support that person, even if that challenging behavior happens. Like we talked about a little bit, changing behavior by changing the environment is a very slow and gradual process. I don't know if you've all experienced this, but it may take years to see a change in that behavior. And so a big thing for us, I think, as providers, that first of all keeps us going in the industry, and then afterwards also supports the individuals in feeling accomplished, is creating a new definition of what progress is. You need to celebrate the small victories, and we'll talk about meaningful engagement, but a big piece is if we engage in an activity today for 5 minutes versus the 0 minutes that occurred last week, hooray. Like, you should be shouting from the rooftops that that was a really successful day for that person. And again, I think, both for the individual and for you as a provider, you feel a lot better about your day, because I think it's really easy to take it personally when you're working every day, you're doing the strategies, you're following the protocol, and you're not seeing that behavior change. In theory, most of the behaviors are changing. It's just happening so small that you need to focus on those tiny changes versus the big picture. A big principle that we work with a lot, especially from the social work perspective, is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, in terms of you always want to meet the individual where they are at. So where they're presenting is very much a part of how you need to support an intervention. And when you're dealing with adults, they typically have a lifetime before they got to you. And so, take as much information as you can. Ask the individual what what has happened to them, what is, how did they get here? Whether they're able to communicate that in detail or just just in small spurts, it's really valuable for you as a provider to acknowledge that they have probably been through a string of providers that maybe weren't great. They've probably been in jobs that maybe they were asked to leave. There's all these pieces that go into what prompts a behavioral response. And so being mindful of that, as well as, of course, trauma triggers, all of those things, it impacts, again, how you as a provider interpret the situation. The lack of completion of a task or the engagement in a challenging behavior is 99% not about you. And so being mindful that these things have occurred in the past with or without you is usually helpful in working through that. We always support our staff in being prepared for the worst case scenario. Educate yourselves, know what that really challenging day would look like, but expect the best every single time you get there. A lot of positive behavior development is so much just your presentation as a provider, and to present in that positive tone, it really changes a lot of the outcomes that you're going to see when you're working with your folks. So to talk a little bit more about the proactive methods, again, proactive is always better than reactive. You want to prepare yourself and the individual for success where you can. And so one of those pieces is identifying yourself as a safe and reinforcing person. Again, a lot of our adults have been in situations where they haven't been safe, they haven't had their basic needs met. And so you're dealing with all of that trauma and all of that response where they're not even sure if they trust you. And that's difficult to do. And as direct care providers and respite professionals, all of those things, you meet an individual and you're expected to be that person's caregiver right off the bat. They are supposed to somehow trust you to make sure that they are safe and that they are going to be supported in managing through those difficult things. So building rapport quickly is definitely a skill set. And there's ways to do that are a little easier to do right off the bat. And then, of course, you build a relationship and go from there. A lot of what we see is just presenting as confident and in control of a situation. Most of the individuals that we work with that engage in really challenging impulsive or explosive type behaviors, they are not feeling calm, they are not feeling in control, and they most certainly don't feel confident in how they're behaving and what that looks like to other people. And so they're going to look to you to support them in managing that. If they look over at you and your face is just as frantic and chaotic as theirs, that's not going to be helpful for them to understand that they're safe. And so just a very simple fact of keeping yourself in control and feeling, I can handle this today, makes a big difference for people when those challenging behaviors happen and they build that trust with you. Positive demeanor goes a really long way. It may seem really silly, but when you're working day in and day out with really difficult individuals, you're dealing with aggressive behaviors and all of those things, it can be very easy to present as worn down. But finding ways to create your work environment so that you have that positive presentation typically, again, leads to that better day. And then in theory, you're feeling less stressed about your experiences. Expect that people are going to push boundaries. That's just a very natural human thing to do, right? When you're in a new situation, when the substitute teacher comes to class, right? You want to try to get that extra time out in the hallway. Those kinds of things are very organic for all of us to do. And so expecting those on a behavioral level is fairly standard. And holding yourself as that confident and in control person, even when those boundaries are being pushed, is really vital. Again, because even though you may feel like you're being firm or overly structured on the first couple times you're working with a person, they again are going to feel trust in you that you're setting up their day to be successful, even though maybe they're trying to work around it a little differently. Keeping your cool again. It's important to think about what you look like when you're dealing with challenging behaviors. Our agency is completely community-based, and so I think about all the time of what does an escalation look like in a confined room versus in the middle of a crowded space, versus at a job site, in an office environment, all sorts of places. And so practicing what that looks like for yourself is an odd thing to think about, but it's really helpful for both the community and for the people that you serve. So I always tell everyone, like, when you're dealing with things like physical aggression, it is not a a typical situation to find yourself in, to have someone, invading your space in that way and escalating towards you, it's very easy to present as flustered, to present as nervous, and all of those things. So I always try to keep people focused on, if you can't maintain that kind of confident and positive affect, then at least try to be neutral. It really goes a long way to the person, as again, we talked a little bit about the causes of behavior. If you start to panic, you're also giving attention to that behavior. So the neutral affect does go a long way. You also want to minimize the effect that behavior has on you. It seems, again, very simple, but it's just simply not about you that day. And so to be mindful that even though that aggressive behavior or the words or whatever it is that's being targeted towards you, it's simply just involving the person and a manifestation of that disability or behavior versus anything that maybe you have prompted or you have started. Yeah, and again, the other thing that works really well, especially if you have the opportunity to be with a group, is pivoting attention to positive behaviors. So focusing on the things that you really want to see. Most times, again, talking about that social piece, most times the individuals that we are working with are looking for some sort of social reinforcement with their behavior. So whether it's wanting attention, one-on-one time, anything like that, being mindful that if you pay attention and give that positive praise to things you want to see, most people are going to adapt their behaviors to fit that need and to receive that kind of attention. Use positive behavior to tell individuals what you do like and not wait for an outburst. I always tell our direct care team too, think about if your provider or your parent only received a phone call when something negative happened, what would you think every time they see your number on the phone? Oh gosh, it's happening again. And so you just need to be mindful of finding opportunities to create positive praise versus only structured around those behaviors. So it may seem, silly, but complimenting an outfit, making a comment on a new haircut, things like that can make people feel great, but without having to wait for that behavior. Again, we're all just people. You want genuine feedback and praise. And so being mindful that your feedback is specific and to the point versus just overarching. The other thing that you want to make sure you do, it's like speaking a different language in positive behavior development, is you want to focus on the behaviors you do like and that you do want to reinforce versus the ones that you'd like to see decrease. And so instead of saying, I like how you stopped hitting today, you want to say, I like how you're sitting with safe hands. Because then that person is going to connect safe hands, positive praise. In theory, it takes time, but you get there. You want to always make sure that what you are doing in response to an inappropriate behavior has a goal and has an intention to teach an appropriate or replacement behavior. Some of the adults that I work with have been in the criminal justice system. You're dealing with people that have been in institutionalized care for 50 plus years of their life. And so not every behavior is something that you need to pick that day to change. Not every behavior is something that, you or I wouldn't engage in at some point, perhaps in heavy traffic on I-25. And so being mindful that you, as a professional, every behavior that you do respond to should be purposeful. And so when you're doing that, it's important to try to focus on that emotion recognition. A lot of our folks that we work with disabilities really struggle with just verbal emotion recognition. I think a lot of people simply struggle with that. And so when you're taking that opportunity to intervene on a behavior, to respond to a behavior, being mindful of supporting that emotion recognition versus pointing out that challenging behavior. So let's say you have an individual who may be, banging their fist on a table, sighing heavily, putting their head down. Obviously, you could see an emotion happening, right? And they're just struggling to articulate what that is, which is why those behaviors are occurring. So you could start by saying to someone, hey, it seems like you are frustrated. A lot of people I do training with say, well, what if you're wrong? What if you pick the wrong emotion? At least you are getting there. And so one of the big victories I had before is I had an individual who, same kind of thing, slamming doors, throwing objects. And I said, you seem frustrated. And at some point they said, no, I'm anxious today. And I was like, hooray, you identified your behavior. Like, that is really great. And your feeling and your emotion and all of that is in there. So after you practice this vocabulary for a while, those individuals start using the same phrasing and they're able to articulate themselves more clearly. You always want to support a replacement behavior as well. I assume you guys know a lot of tips and tricks about coping skills, taking breaks, deep breathing goes a really long way as well. And so always offering that opportunity and putting it in the place of a choice is really meaningful to people, because when you're escalated, you're not hearing much of what's going on. You're not yourself. You're not in a place where you're feeling in control. And so giving a direct prompt sometimes escalates the behavior further, but providing choices allows them to feel in control. So for example, you see that frustration, you identify it. Would you like to take a break or listen to some music? That gives a choice. It's not you demanding that something is getting done, and typically you're able to redirect. I think the other thing that's really vital with behavior intervention is just being aware when your prompts are ineffective. I think when you get nervous, when you're dealing with a difficult behavior, people tend to overprompt. Would you like to take a break? Would you? Would you? That doesn't make me feel calm. And so just being mindful that it's okay to simply say, we're going to take a break from this right now, and I'll come back and support you in a moment. That's totally okay. And for you as a professional, sometimes that's really meaningful to collect yourself and make sure you're presenting in a way that's going to be therapeutically helpful for the folks with difficult behaviors. Yeah, this is just more of the same. You want to make sure that you have a plan and a support system that's within your reach. You don't ever want to respond with ultimatums, negative consequences, things like that, because it's, first of all, just not appropriate for dealing with at-risk populations, but also it's not successful. And so being mindful of knowing the plan, having a strategy that's within your reach, and asking for support if you don't. If you're working with a new individual, I find it with respite to be increasingly difficult because a lot of our respite providers get a tidbit of what that person's day looks like, either at the start or the end. And so being mindful that, ask the questions that you need, know the behavior plan, and if one doesn't exist, push for one to get created so that you could be successful. Yep, again here, having a plan that's fair within your reach. It may sound really silly, but when high intensity behaviors are happening, it's very easy to try to push for an incentive that may not be even possible. So I've had, new direct care providers say, oh, if we do a great job today, we could sit in the front seat or whatever that may look like. That may not be an option for that person. We may not be even getting in the car. So being mindful that if you are going to use an incentive system, which is a piece that we may talk about as well, but making sure that you're using it in a way that's first of all meaningful, and second of all that's in your reach, because if you support someone with an incentive, you want to be able to follow through with that. Otherwise that behavior reinforcement is not going to exist. So these are just a couple of tricks, and again, this will be posted on the website as well, but these are just a bunch of different strategies that work proactively. For most of our folks, like we talked about, scheduling, pre-queuing, letting them know what's going to happen that day. We talk about this a lot with our Community Connections program. It's a very normal question to say, what are we doing today? And a lot of people are like, well, that's behavioral, they're perseverating. They're not, they simply just want to know what's going on that day. And so being mindful of those things when you're working through and making sure you don't overgeneralize what's a behavior and what is just a very typical question for somebody who's not sure where they're going that day. So there's all of those little tips and tricks there. Reactive procedures are something that the reality is when you're dealing with really high risk behaviors such as physical aggression, elopement, self-injury, you do have to react, right? As care providers, we do have the obligation to keep individuals safe, and especially to keep peers safe as well. We work with a lot of high risk individuals, and when you put a lot of high risk folks in one location, situations escalate well beyond what you think they may. And so we need to be mindful of what those currently look like for your agency or for who you're working with. Our agency supports the nonviolent crisis intervention model, which focuses a lot on first verbal de-escalation, and then the least restrictive kind of supports if and when physical intervention is needed. A lot of our folks are to the place where, we could change that environment to manage a really high risk situation. And that's something we'll talk about as well. Because for the most part, there are so many things that you could do to mitigate even a really intensive situation that don't involve invading a someone's personal space or to involve any sort of, safety procedures. But it's just important to be aware that those things do exist, especially with really difficult individuals. And so being mindful of asking those questions, making sure that as a provider, you're prepared for that, and knowing what your agency or who you're working with it can train you in for those things. Sensory interventions. We didn't talk about this a ton, but sometimes behavior is simply just a response to a sensory overload or a sensory deficit. And so just being mindful of what those look like and offering those for folks. We do a lot of, squeezing, and sometimes that can help ground a person and help get them back. And so, for example, we have one individual that when he's feeling very anxious, he'll say, "Can I have a squeeze?" It took him very long to get to that place to identify that's what he needed, which was amazing. But for him, it's just a simple handhold, and we're taking a deep breath and we're ready to take on the day. And so, sometimes your redirection and your proactive strategies are not the core of what the issue is. And so talking to the people that you're working with, making sure that you're acknowledging that it may be something different than just those social responses. So for us at Sample Supports, almost actually all of our activities that we do are community-based, with the intention that we are creating an integrated environment for the people that we serve, and also supporting them in creating meaningful interactions with people, obtaining meaningful employment, existing in a setting that's integrated to them versus exclusive of them. And so anybody who's worked direct care, behaviors happen. And typically when you're trying to make a meaningful experience occur, that could be different, that could be pushing those boundaries a little too far. And so, just because a behavior is happening doesn't mean that that engagement can't exist. And so just breaking down a little bit of what that looks like here may be helpful for all of you, especially those of you who work in the community, because it's very easy to get derailed by the reactions of the public, by the reactions of other people, and keeping your focus on the folks and services is really helpful. So what is meaningful engagement? It's a very broad term, but a lot of times you can simply ask the person that you're working with, what are you looking to get out of this today? Oh, I want to introduce myself to this person in the community, or I want to go to this shop and purchase this item, or I want to finish this task at work. Increasing that conversation wherever you can as a provider is always going to make your job easier, because you're going to be serving the person the way they would like to be served. On a general level, a lot of what meaningful engagement looks like is community interaction. So not just simply going to a community location and then separating a group of people with disabilities to sit independently. This is engaging in the community, finding opportunities to work with others, to volunteer, to provide ways to give back in any way that you or I would. The other piece is when you're looking at meaningful engagement is you always do want to identify that structure and a goal. For you, it could be very clear of, yes, we're going to finish our work task today. We were talking about the breweries earlier, so okay, we want to finish this pallet today. It seems very obvious, but if you don't articulate that out loud, you guys may be operating on different goals. So the individual and services goal is like, perhaps that they're getting to their lunch break and then they'll deal with the rest of the day from there. And for you, you're like, the whole pallet, we're going to do it right now. And so making sure you're on the same page as a provider does a lot for that meaningful engagement, both for you and for the individual. With employment services specifically, we do put a lot of emphasis on the fact that we are supporting people in competitive and integrative jobs. And so employment, and like all of us, we have tasks that we need to complete during that day. So just because the individual may present as though they don't want to complete a task, it doesn't mean that you can't motivate them and support them to get there. And so just being mindful of doing that in a way that's easy and supportive of them, but also holding them accountable of, hey, we got this job because we could do this. Let's do it together. When you're dealing with in-home services, I think sometimes the meaningful engagement may be difficult to identify. So, you're working on just simply building those skills to be as successful as you can in the home or in a fun activity. It may seem more vague than an employment goal or a day program goal, but most places you could find something that person wants to work on, whether it's helping support a dinner routine or, just sharing something that they want with you. That could count as that interaction. Typically, when you're trying to do something and you're engaging, let's say you are interacting with that community member, you made it to that location, you feel like a connection's forming, and then that person may get overwhelmed. Let's say maybe the social portion starts to go over to a side that may be inappropriate, or our volume is not okay. Those kinds of things, they happen, and that's a lot of the learning process, and what you guys as providers are there to help with is redirecting that back into a place of, hey, we struggled a little bit, but we're back on track, and let's keep this going. And so a big part of that is simply just sticking with the plan regardless of those behavioral interruptions. it's very easy, especially when you're in an employment environment with a group of other people, that if a behavior occurs, you're like, well, we're done for the day, we're gonna go. That doesn't support that person in fulfilling their obligations. It doesn't support the community in seeing that we could work through these things, that these are simply just little roadblocks that we have to get over. And ultimately, it allows that person's behavior to maybe achieve that goal of escaping that activity and not having to fulfill those expectations. So what we focus a lot on is even though that plan may be interrupted, let's get to that end goal. It may need to be an edited end goal, right? If our behavior took up the first, 3 hours of the day, we may not be able to get in as much activity, but let's stick with the second half of the day plan, or let's get one of those tasks done instead of all of them. And again, that goes back to that rapport as well, where that person that you're working with is going to feel that trust with you of, hey, just because I did this, they're not going to give up on me. They're still here and they're still supporting me and getting through this and making it so that I could be successful. I think just to go through quickly, am I doing okay on time? Okay, just to make sure that we go through some most common behaviors. Again, we're predominantly community-based, so these are the big ones that we see. I know that in-home services, these are also fairly similar, so just going through these a little bit. I think in the community, what is very noticeable is like verbal aggression and disruption. And so simply, that could be as simple as just somebody not understanding the tone in the room, right? So just being, a couple of decibels louder than everybody else there. That could also go into more targeted verbal engagements, whether it's towards you as the provider, which is fairly typical, their peers, or oftentimes we see individuals that will verbally escalate towards members of the community. I'm sure you all know it is very difficult to control the responses of other members in the community, but you're there to kind of jump in with your intervention skills and to make it okay. I think with verbal aggression specifically and physical aggression as well, a lot of times what you notice happens is you may be dealing with an escalation, you look up and that whole room is looking at you. As the provider, that feels stressful, but imagine how that feels for that person in services. I would feel really stressed out if that was happening, if I was having a bad day and I had an audience. And so as a provider, what we train our staff to do is being comfortable with having those conversations after that incident has ended. And so sometimes, either with the person or just to go over of, hey, I noticed that you were kind of seeing what we were doing over there. Did you have any questions on what we're doing here today, or who we are, or why we're here? And creating that open community conversation to a very, again, natural response. If someone were to walk into this room and engage in a verbal disruption, we'd all probably look. And so engaging those, advocacy-based and person-centered conversations, first of all, supports the community in learning more about what we're doing. And then secondly, re-engages that person to, again, like, my provider is here to support me, whether or not this thing happened today, and we're moving on. Brushing it off our shoulders. We use that expression a lot with our folks. We're brushing it off and we're moving on. And so it's you reinforcing that confidence that, again, is going to build that rapport, which makes all of your proactive procedures a lot more effective. Physical aggression is challenging, especially, again, in a community-based day program, we may have groups of 4 individuals and an aggressive incident can occur, and you do have to mitigate that immediately. You have to make sure that that health and safety is maintained, which may require, any sort of, there may be a physical hold that may have to be used, there may be a redirection, but a lot of the times, it's just being mindful that once that immediate safety is taken care of, again, to try to refocus your energy as well as the person's energy back into that thing you were doing. I think physical aggression with a lot of the folks that we deal with is really just a large amount of energy draining from both you and the people that you're working with. So it's very easy after an aggressive incident to just be like, well, we're both done for the day. But it's really meaningful to the person if you're able to get them back on track. With physical aggression, again, it really does depend on what your agency or the provider group that you're working with does want you to follow in terms of those protocols, but be an advocate to ask for those. Almost every agency is going to have some sort of plan if and when those things happen, and if there is no plan, then advocate for more support and services. There's a ton of behavioral providers, ourselves included, that go and do consultation and training for all sorts of groups to make sure that you're prepared for those instances. The other thing too with all of these really difficult behaviors is being prepared in your environment. And so if you get that individual in the car in the morning and we're already struggling with physical and verbal aggression, maybe we're going to a space that's a little more open versus confined before we go to the next space. Same thing with elopement. Again, it's very specific to agency protocols, but the safety piece needs to be maintained. Refusal, I think, is the most common form of engagement interruption, where the person is just like, not doing this today. And of course, I really liked the part about the can't versus won't, because I think with refusal, that's really important too, is to develop, are we refusing to do this because we're worried we can't? Or is it something that we're just simply not choosing to do today? I think this is the most easy thing to get irritated by as a provider, because you have a schedule and sometimes we're refusing for 4 hours and there goes our engagement. That's okay. Just simply be ready to wait it out and redefine that progress for the day. And so if you only have 2 hours left because we were refusing for 4, that's okay. You could still accomplish some of those goals. And I think just in general, it may seem like a very silly thing to say, but when you're supporting adults, treat all adults as adults. Most of the individuals we serve on some level can have a conversation or, sign or some sort of nonverbal communication where you can understand what they're looking for that day. They wake up on the wrong side of the bed just like all of us do. And so keeping your expectations realistic and just making sure you're being mindful of the rights of people and services and of all people in the community when you're providing care. Again, it may seem very simple, but if you encompass that, most of the intention and the follow through of your interventions is always going to be positive. And a lot of this, again, is just asking for support. And so our agency is available to do all sorts of services. So we do everything from host homes to supported apartment settings for adults, as well as foster care for children. We do community-based day and employment services, in-home supports through our supported living services waiver, as well as behavioral and mental health services for all ages. And so if you feel like, where you're working may need that extra support, or the individual you're working with may need additional resources, they are always usually out there. I'll make sure to share my information so that you can all access that after the presentation. But yeah, the support is out there, and so just being mindful of advocating for that if and when you need. The other thing we do as an agency, which is really meaningful, I think, for our teams, is that we practice. We practice interventions, we prepare for the day, we share experiences. Everyone's going to have a challenging day, you as a provider and the individuals. And so to find a way to build rapport, both with the people you're working with and your coworkers, to talk about those things, we find has created a really much more functional environment for the people that we serve. Thank you. Sorry, I had to speed through that. Mine was also previously an hour. So I appreciate you guys going with that. Do we have any questions specifically to maybe any situations that you need guidance on, or anything specific that maybe I didn't cover? Okay, well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And this should all be available online as well. Oh.